The judge looked at the man standing quietly at the defense table and immediately lost patience. "Let's not waste the court's time with theatrics," he said, already reaching for the next file as if the outcome had been decided before the man even entered the room. But what the judge didn't know was that the man he had just dismissed had spent the last 18 months documenting cases exactly like this one, inside courtrooms just like his. And this wasn't his first stop. The courtroom felt routine. That was the first problem. There was a rhythm to it. The quiet shuffle of papers, the low murmur of clerks, the distant echo of footsteps in the hallway outside. People moved like they had done this 1,000 times before. Because they had. And Judge Harold Vance relied on that rhythm. He thrived in it, controlled it, weaponized it. He leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers resting against the edge of the bench, eyes already drifting past the man in front of him as if searching for something more important. There wasn't anything more important. But that was the illusion he maintained. The man at the defense table didn't move. Mid-40s, plain clothes, neutral posture, no visible reaction. That bothered the judge more than he expected. Most people shifted under pressure, cleared their throats, adjusted their stance, tried to speak too soon, tried to explain too much. This one didn't. He simply stood there, watching, waiting. There was something else, too. Something the room hadn't picked up on yet. The man hadn't brought a lawyer. That alone drew a few glances from the gallery. Not dramatic ones, just subtle shifts. A tilt of the head. A quiet curiosity. People without representation in this courtroom didn't usually stand that straight, didn't look that calm, didn't look like they already knew how this was going to go. The judge flipped open the file. "Mr. Carter," he said, not looking up yet, "you've been cited for failure to comply with municipal occupancy regulations. Multiple violations, repeated notices ignored." A pause, then, almost as an afterthought, "And now you've decided to appear." A few light chuckles came from the side benches, small, dismissive, encouraged. The judge glanced up now, just briefly, expecting to see the usual reaction. Apology, nervousness, excuses. Instead, nothing. The man, Carter, met his eyes calmly. That was the second problem. "You understand the severity of these violations?" the judge continued, voice flattening slightly. Carter nodded once. "I do." His voice was steady, measured, not defensive, not aggressive, just certain. The tone didn't belong here. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Then, I assume you also understand that this court has the authority to impose immediate penalties, including fines, property seizure, and, if necessary, enforcement action." Another pause. Waiting for it. Still nothing. Carter didn't flinch, didn't interrupt, didn't rush to speak. The judge tapped the file with his finger. A subtle sign of irritation. "Do you have anything to say before I proceed?" There it was. The opening. The moment where most people tried to explain themselves into a corner. Carter took a breath. Not a nervous one, a controlled one. And then, "Yes, Your Honor." A slight shift in the room. Not loud, but noticeable. Because of how he said it. Not pleading, not rushed, just ready. "I believe there may be a procedural issue with how these citations were issued." The words landed softly, but they didn't belong in this courtroom. Not from someone standing alone at that table. The judge's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Procedural issue. That was language, legal language. Not something people casually used unless they understood exactly what they were implying. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that Carter didn't elaborate. He stopped there. Let it sit. Let the room lean into it. That was deliberate. The judge exhaled slowly through his nose. Then you should have brought counsel, he said dismissively. This is not the place for amateur interpretations of the law. A few more quiet chuckles. Encouraged again. Controlled again. But something had shifted, just slightly, because Carter didn't react to that either. Instead, he reached down and placed a single folder on the table. Not rushed, not dramatic, just precise. That movement drew more attention than anything he had said so far, because it broke the rhythm. The judge noticed it immediately. "What is that?" he asked. "A record of notices," Carter replied. Again, calm. Measured, the judge waved a hand dismissively. "We already have records on file. These are different." That did it. That was the third problem. The room didn't react all at once. It never does. It was slower than that. A shift in posture, a glance between two clerks. The court reporter pausing just half a second longer than usual before typing, because the tone had changed, and everyone felt it. The judge straightened slightly. "Different how?" Carter didn't answer immediately. Again, deliberate. Again, controlled. Then he opened the folder. Inside, copies, stamped, dated, organized. Too organized. "These notices," Carter said, sliding one forward slightly, "were issued before the inspection dates listed in your records." Silence. Not loud, but complete. Because that sentence didn't just challenge a detail. It challenged the process. The judge looked down at the document. Only briefly. Then back up. Dismissal ready. "It's not uncommon for administrative dates to vary." "These are signed," Carter said quietly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't interrupt aggressively. He just placed the words exactly where they needed to go. Signed. Before inspection. That wasn't variation. That was something else. And now, the room knew it. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that Carter still wasn't pushing. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't trying to win. He was letting the judge walk toward it. One step at a time. Judge Vance felt it now. That subtle shift. That loss of control. Small, but undeniable. So he did what he always did. He tightened. "We are not here to debate clerical discrepancies," he said, voice sharpening. "We are here to determine compliance." And there it was, authority, reasserted, controlled, or at least that's what it sounded like. Carter nodded once, as if he expected that answer, as if he had been waiting for it. "Understood," he said. A pause. Then, "In that case, I'd like to request that the court formally enter these documents into the record." That landed differently. Because now, it wasn't a conversation, it was procedure, and procedure couldn't be dismissed the same way. The judge hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Most people wouldn't notice it, but a few did. The clerk, the bailiff, and someone sitting quietly in the back row, watching everything. Because what no one in that courtroom knew yet was that this wasn't just about citations, and it wasn't just about one property, and it definitely wasn't just about this judge. This courtroom, this exact one, had already appeared in 2 internal reports, unreleased, unacknowledged, buried, for now. And Carter was the reason those reports existed, but that wasn't the part he was here for today. Not yet. The judge exhaled slowly, then gave a short nod. "Fine," he said. Entered. But the word didn't carry the same weight it usually did, because something had already shifted. Something subtle, something quiet, something irreversible. And as the clerk reached for the documents, Carter finally looked up, not at the judge, but past him, toward the back of the courtroom. Just for a moment, as if confirming something or someone. Then he looked forward again, calm as ever. And that's when the first real mistake was made, because the judge leaned forward and said something he wouldn't be able to take back. Let me make this very clear, Judge Vance said, voice tightening just enough to signal control. This court will not be manipulated by selectively presented paperwork. A pause, then sharper. If you're attempting to undermine these proceedings, Mr. Carter, it will not end well for you. The room went still, because that wasn't procedural anymore. That was personal. And Carter didn't respond. Not immediately, because what the judge didn't know, what no one in that room knew yet, was that every word being said, every reaction, every deviation from standard conduct was already being documented, cross-referenced, time-stamped, and somewhere far outside that courtroom, a file had just been updated, with this judge's name again. Carter finally spoke, quietly, carefully, almost gently. I'm not trying to undermine anything, Your Honor. A pause. Then, I'm trying to understand why the same pattern keeps appearing. That sentence didn't belong in a defense. It belonged in an investigation. And for the first time, Judge Vance didn't have an immediate response, because something else had just entered the room, something unseen, something much larger than a citation, and it had been there longer than anyone realized. The silence didn't break all at once. It stretched, thin, tense, uncomfortable in a way this courtroom wasn't used to, because this wasn't confusion, it was recognition, not full recognition. No one in the room could quite name what they were feeling yet, but something had shifted beneath the surface, something subtle, but heavy enough that even the smallest movement now felt louder than it should. Judge Vance adjusted slightly in his seat. A small movement, controlled but unnecessary, and that was the first sign. I'm not interested in patterns, he said, voice flattening again, trying to pull the room back into something familiar. I'm interested in facts. He tapped the file again, too quickly this time. Facts show repeated violations, notices issued, non-compliance. That's what matters. That sounded right. That sounded like authority. That sounded like control. But it wasn't landing the same way anymore, because now everyone was aware of the documents sitting on that table. Carter didn't look at the judge. He looked at the clerk. Would you mind reading the first notice date into the record? Polite, measured, respectful, but intentional. Because now he wasn't addressing authority. He was engaging process. The clerk hesitated, just slightly, eyes flicking toward the judge. That moment mattered more than anything said so far. Because in that hesitation, the courtroom revealed something it never intended to. Dependence, not on law, on him. Judge Vance noticed it too, and he didn't like it. Proceed, he said, sharper than before. The clerk picked up the document, cleared her throat. Notice of violation, dated March 3rd. Her voice was steady, but quieter than usual. Because now she understood. She wasn't just reading, she was confirming something. Carter nodded once. Thank you. Then he gently slid another document forward. And the inspection date associated with the notice, another pause. Longer this time. Because now, people were anticipating the answer. The clerk checked the second page, her brow furrowed. Not dramatically, just enough. Inspection. Recorded as March 8th. The air changed. You could feel it. Not loud, not explosive, but undeniable. Because now it wasn't a claim, it was a fact. 5 days. The notice came 5 days before the inspection. Judge Vance leaned back, slowly, buying time. That doesn't necessarily indicate there are 11 more, Carter said quietly. No aggression, no interruption, just placement. Again. Perfect placement. And that was when the room truly shifted, because now, this wasn't a discrepancy. It was a pattern. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. Then present them. Short, controlled, but there was something else underneath it now. Irritation wasn't the right word. It was closer to pressure. Carter didn't rush. He didn't stack the papers dramatically. He didn't try to overwhelm. He simply turned the folder slightly, enough for the clerk to see. Organized tabs. Dates aligned. Cross-referenced. Prepared long before this moment. And that's when something else became clear. This wasn't reactive. This was planned. The clerk began reading, one by one, each notice, each inspection, each mismatch, each confirmation. March 12th, inspection. March 16th. April 2nd, inspection. April 7th. April the 19th, inspection. April 22nd. It didn't take long. 3 entries in. The room understood. 5 entries in. The room accepted it. 7 entries in. The room stopped looking at Carter and started looking at the judge. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that this still wasn't the full picture. Carter stepped back slightly, not retreating, just giving space, letting the information breathe, letting the room process it. Because forcing it now would weaken it, and he knew that. Judge Vance exhaled slowly, then leaned forward again. Reassertion. He needed it. "This suggests administrative error," he said. "Nothing more." It sounded reasonable. It sounded like recovery. It sounded like something that could still be controlled. But Carter tilted his head slightly. Not in disagreement, in curiosity. "That's possible," he said. A pause. Then, "But unlikely." That word landed harder than anything before it. Because it didn't accuse, it evaluated. The judge's jaw tightened. "You're not in a position to determine likelihood?" Carter nodded. "Agreed." And for a brief moment, it felt like he had conceded. But then, "I'm only in a position to observe repetition." That was the fourth problem, because now, this wasn't about being right. It was about something repeating, and repetition implies system. A quiet shift came from the back of the courtroom. Someone adjusted in their seat. Someone who hadn't moved until now, still watching, still silent. Judge Vance noticed, just a glance, but enough. And for the first time, a question entered his mind that hadn't been there before. Who else is paying attention? He pushed it down immediately. Returned to control. "This line of discussion is irrelevant," he said. "We are not conducting an investigation." And that's when Carter did something different, something small, but precise. He smiled. Not broadly, not provocatively, just slightly. "Respectfully," he said, "it already is." That sentence didn't raise his voice, didn't challenge authority directly, but it changed the entire frame of the room. Because now, the question wasn't whether something was wrong. The question was how long it had been happening. And that's when the judge made his second mistake. He leaned forward, too fast this time, voice sharper than before. "This court will not entertain baseless implications of misconduct." There it was, said out loud, on record. And Carter didn't respond, not immediately. Because this was the moment he had been waiting for. Not the documents, not the discrepancies, not even the pattern. The reaction. Because reactions reveal more than evidence ever could. Carter reached into the folder again. But this time, he didn't pull out another notice. He pulled out something else. A printed sheet. Different format. Different structure. Official. But not from this court. He placed it gently on the table. Didn't slide it forward yet. Didn't present it. Just let it sit there. The judge noticed immediately. "What is that?" Carter looked at it briefly, then back up. "That," he said calmly, "is where the pattern becomes harder to dismiss." And just like that, The room leaned in again, because everyone understood something now. The documents so far, those were internal, contained, dismissible. But this, whatever this was, came from somewhere else. And somewhere in the back of the courtroom, the man who hadn't moved yet finally shifted forward, just slightly, because he recognized the format. And that meant this was bigger than one courtroom, much bigger. Carter rested his hand lightly on the paper, still not pushing it forward, still not forcing the moment, because timing mattered, and he had learned timing was everything. What he didn't know, Carter said quietly, almost to himself, was that this wasn't the only place it was happening. And for the first time, Judge Vance didn't interrupt, because something unfamiliar had just entered his chest. Not anger, not irritation, something colder, uncertainty. The word hung in the air longer than it should have. Uncertainty. It didn't belong in that courtroom. Not in Judge Vance's courtroom. Everything there was designed to eliminate it. Structured procedure, controlled dialogue, predictable outcomes. Even conflict had a rhythm to it. But now that rhythm was gone, and everyone could feel it. Judge Vance's eyes locked onto the paper resting beneath Carter's hand. He didn't ask again what it was, because now he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. "Submit it," he said finally. The words were measured, but thinner than before. Carter didn't move right away. That hesitation wasn't defiance. It was control, because once that document crossed the table, the room wouldn't go back. "You're certain?" Carter asked. Soft, respectful, but deliberate. A few heads turned at that. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. He wasn't asking permission. He was offering a boundary. Judge Vance felt it immediately and rejected it just as fast. "I gave you an instruction, Mr. Carter." There it was again. Authority, reasserted. But now, it sounded like it was trying to convince the room. Carter nodded once, then finally, he slid the document forward. The clerk received it first. Her fingers paused for just a fraction of a second as she adjusted it into view, because now she could see the header. And the moment she did, her posture changed, not dramatically, but enough. Well, enough that the bailiff noticed, enough that the court reporter slowed, enough that Judge Vance leaned forward again, this time not out of control, but out of need. "Read it," he said. The clerk swallowed lightly, then began. "Internal Review Memorandum." A pause. Her eyes moved faster now, scanning ahead, trying to understand what she was holding before saying too much out loud. "Regional Oversight Division." The words didn't hit the room all at once. They landed in pieces, first confusion, then recognition, then something else. Because that name, it had been heard before, quietly, indirectly, usually in conversations that ended quickly. The Regional Oversight Division, not public-facing, not discussed openly, but always present when something had gone too far. The clerk continued. Subject, preliminary pattern analysis, municipal enforcement discrepancies. Her voice slowed, because now she understood what she was reading, including but not limited to case clusters identified in... She stopped, just for a second, eyes flicking up. Judge Vance's voice cut in. Continue. Identified in 3 jurisdictions. A breath. Then, including this court. That was it. That was the moment. The room didn't react loudly. There was no gasp, no outburst. But everything changed. Because now, this wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a claim. It wasn't even an argument. It was documentation from somewhere above this courtroom. Judge Vance didn't move, didn't speak, didn't interrupt. But something behind his eyes shifted. fast. "Is this document authenticated?" he asked. The question came quickly. Too quickly. Carter nodded. "Yes." "How?" Another pause, measured. Then, "It was provided to me as part of a compliance review request." That answer sounded simple, but it wasn't. Because compliance review request wasn't something individuals filed casually. It wasn't a form you downloaded. It wasn't a complaint you submitted online. It was internal language. And now, the room knew Carter wasn't just someone responding to citations. He was inside something. The judge leaned back again. Slower this time, more deliberate. "That doesn't grant you authority to introduce internal documents into open court." There it was, a line drawn. Late, but drawn. Carter nodded. "I understand." And again, for a moment, it sounded like agreement, but then, "That's why I didn't introduce it." The judge's eyes narrowed. "I requested it be read." Silence, because that distinction, small as it sounded, mattered. A lot. The judge looked at the clerk, then at the document, then back at Carter. And for the first time, he realized something he hadn't considered before. This man wasn't reacting to the courtroom. He was guiding it, step by step, without ever raising his voice, without ever breaking form, without ever appearing to challenge authority directly. And that made it harder to stop. Because there was no clear line to shut down, only movement. Controlled movement. Judge Vance exhaled slowly, then leaned forward again. "This court does not operate under external pressure," he said. Carter didn't respond, because that wasn't the point. The point was that it already was, and everyone in the room, whether they admitted it or not, could feel it now. The judge turned back to the clerk. "Is there anything in that document that directly references this case?" The clerk scanned quickly, her fingers tightening slightly around the page. "Not this case specifically," she said. There it was. An opening. Judge Vance moved on it immediately. "Then it is irrelevant." He said it cleanly, confidently. But something was off, because this time, no one relaxed, no one wrote it off, no one returned to normal. Because even if it didn't name this case, it named this courtroom. And that was enough. Carter finally stepped forward again, just slightly. "Your Honor," he said, "may I ask one question?" The judge didn't like that. Not anymore. But denying it now would feel different, too visible. "Proceed." Carter nodded. "Before today," he said, "were you aware that your court had been included in a regional pattern analysis?" The question landed softly, but it cut deeper than anything before it, because it forced something the judge had avoided so far. Acknowledgement, not of wrongdoing, but of awareness. And that was much harder to navigate. Judge Vance held his gaze, didn't answer immediately, because now every response had weight. "Yes," he said finally, short, controlled, but real. And that was the third mistake, because Carter nodded once. "Thank you." No follow-up, no pressure, no push, just acknowledgement. And somehow, that made it worse, because now the room had something it didn't have before. Confirmation. Not that something was wrong, but that something had already been noticed. Before today, before this case, before Carter ever walked into that room. And that meant this wasn't the beginning. It was a continuation of something much larger, something already in motion, something that hadn't finished yet. And as that realization settled quietly into the room, Carter reached back into the folder one more time. But this time, he didn't pull anything out. He just rested his hand there. Because now, he didn't need more evidence. Now, he needed something else. Timing. And somewhere beyond that courtroom, far beyond it, Another file updated, another timestamp locked in, another courtroom added to a growing list, cities, jurisdictions, patterns, and at the center of it, the same quiet approach, the same calm presence, the same name appearing again and again and again. Carter. But that wasn't the name they were tracking. Not anymore. The name they were tracking wasn't Carter. It hadn't been for a while. The shift was subtle, but now it had weight. In rooms like this, names mattered. Titles mattered more. But patterns? Patterns rewrote everything. Judge Vance sat still, but his stillness had changed. Before, it had been control. Now, it was calculation. He looked down at the document again, then at Carter. Then, briefly, toward the back of the courtroom. That same instinct again. Who else is watching? Because something wasn't lining up anymore. This didn't feel like a defendant reacting to citations. It didn't even feel like a legal argument. It felt like positioning. "You've made your point," the judge said finally. Measured, careful, almost restrained. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that he didn't define what the point was. Carter noticed. Of course he did. "I haven't made a point, Your Honor," he said calmly. A pause. Then, "I've only presented a sequence." That word again. Sequence. Not accusation, not argument. Sequence. Which meant there was more. And now the entire room knew it. Judge Vance's fingers pressed lightly against the bench, not tapping anymore, not restless, anchoring. Because something had started slipping, not visibly, not enough for anyone to call out, but enough for him to feel it. "Then let's be clear," the judge said, voice tightening just slightly. "Where exactly is this sequence leading?" There it was, the first real question. Not dismissal, not deflection, engagement. And Carter didn't answer immediately. Because this was the moment where most people made a mistake. They rushed, they explained too much, they revealed too early. He didn't. Instead, he looked down at the folder again, then slowly closed it. That movement landed harder than anything he had done so far. Because closing the folder didn't signal the end. It signaled control. "I don't think it's leading anywhere," Carter said, soft, even. "I think it's already been somewhere." Silence. Because now, the room had to process something new. This wasn't unfolding. It had unfolded, and they were just arriving late. Judge Vance leaned forward again, more slowly this time. "Explain." The word came out quieter. Not weaker, but careful. And that was new. Carter met his eyes. "There are timestamps attached to every notice," he said. "You've seen that." The judge didn't respond. "There are timestamps attached to every inspection," Carter continued. "You've seen that too." Still nothing. "And now," Carter said, "there are timestamps attached to internal reviews." That one landed differently. Because internal reviews weren't part of the courtroom. They existed outside it, above it. And that meant this wasn't contained. The judge's jaw tightened slightly. "And what are you suggesting?" he asked. Carter tilted his head just slightly. "I'm not suggesting anything." A pause. "I'm aligning timelines." That was the fifth problem. Because timelines don't argue. They reveal. And once something is revealed, you can't unsee it. The clerk shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. But enough. Because now, she wasn't just reading documents. She was remembering them. Dates, cases, patterns she hadn't questioned before. The bailiff crossed his arms. Not defensive, protective. And in the back of the room, the man who had been silent this entire time finally leaned forward fully, elbows on knees, eyes locked. Because now, he knew exactly what he was looking at, and more importantly, what it would become. Judge Vance noticed him again, that same presence, unfamiliar, uninvited, but not accidental. "Is there someone else you'd like to bring into this discussion, Mr. Carter?" the judge asked suddenly. There it was, a reach, a probe. Because now, he felt it too. This wasn't one person. Carter didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the back of the room. "No," he said, simply. Another pause. "Not yet." That answer didn't raise his voice, didn't challenge the judge directly. But it changed everything. Because now, there was a timeline, and it hadn't reached its final point. The judge exhaled slowly. "You're walking a very fine line," he said. Carter nodded. "I know. And you seem very comfortable doing it." Another nod. "Yes." That honesty, that lack of hesitation, that complete absence of fear, it didn't fit. And that was the sixth problem, because now the judge wasn't dealing with resistance. He was dealing with certainty. And certainty doesn't escalate the way fear does. It waits. And waiting is harder to control. The judge shifted his posture again, a subtle reset. "This court will proceed with its ruling," he said. There it was, an attempt to regain forward motion, to close the gap, to end the moment. But Carter spoke again. One sentence, quiet, precise. "Before you do that," the judge stopped, not visibly, but enough, because now interrupting would feel different. "You may want to check the last page of that document." Silence, because now everyone in the room knew there was a last page, and no one had seen it yet. The clerk looked down, slowly turned the page. Her eyes moved quickly at first, then stopped and didn't move again. Her grip tightened, not dramatically, but enough. The judge noticed. "Read it." The clerk didn't respond immediately. That hesitation, longer this time, was louder than anything spoken so far. "Read it," the judge repeated, and this time, she did. Recommendation for escalation to formal inquiry. The room stilled. Pending confirmation of supervisory awareness, a breath, then, and judicial acknowledgement. Everything stopped. Not physically, but internally, because that last line wasn't about the past. It was about now. Judge Vance didn't move, didn't speak, didn't react, but something had just locked into place, because minutes ago, he had answered a question, a simple one. Yes. And now, that answer wasn't just part of the room. It was part of something else, something recorded, something filed, something that had been waiting for confirmation, and it had just gotten it. Carter didn't move, didn't speak, didn't need to, because now the sequence was complete, not finished, but complete enough. And somewhere far beyond that courtroom, a system moved forward, quietly, efficiently, irreversibly, and in the back row. The man who had been watching finally stood up, not abruptly, not dramatically, just deliberately, as if his presence was no longer optional. The movement drew attention, but not all at once. It began with the bailiff, a slight turn of the head, then the clerk, whose eyes lifted just enough to register that someone had stood. Then, the gallery, one by one, like a slow ripple moving across still water. By the time Judge Vance noticed, the room had already shifted again. The man in the back didn't rush forward. He didn't announce himself. He didn't even look at the judge right away. He simply stepped into the aisle, calm, measured, unhurried. And that was the seventh problem, because nothing about this felt reactive. Judge Vance straightened. "This is a closed proceeding," he said, voice firm again, reaching for structure. If you have business before the court, you'll identify yourself properly. The man stopped halfway down the aisle. Not at the front. Not yet. I will, he said. His voice was even, not loud, but it carried, and something about it felt familiar. Not to everyone, but to the right people. Carter didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge him, but his posture shifted, just slightly, as if something had just aligned. The judge noticed that too. Then do it now, Judge Vance said. The man took one more step forward, then reached into the inside of his coat. The bailiff moved instantly, one step forward, hand hovering near his belt. Stop right there. The man stopped, calmly, immediately, hands visible, and then, slowly, he pulled out a slim, dark wallet, flipped it open, held it up, not toward the judge, toward the bailiff, because he understood something most people didn't. Control doesn't always sit at the top. Sometimes it stands at the door. The bailiff leaned in slightly, just enough to see. And then everything about his posture changed, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough. His shoulders lowered, his stance widened, not defensive anymore, but stabilizing. And then he stepped back. That's fine, the bailiff said quietly. 2 words. But they landed harder than anything else in the last 10 minutes. Because the bailiff didn't ask questions, he didn't challenge, he accepted immediately. Judge Vance saw it, and now he felt it. Approach, the judge said, but this time it didn't sound like a command. It sounded like a necessity. The man walked forward, steady, controlled, every step deliberate, until he reached the front, and only then did he turn his attention to the bench. Good afternoon, Your Honor. The tone was respectful, but there was no deference in it, and that distinction was impossible to ignore. Identify yourself, Judge Vance said. The man held the wallet again, this time angled slightly higher, not for the room, for the judge. A brief flash, too quick for most to read, but not too quick to understand. Because the judge's expression changed just slightly, just enough. Name, the judge said, but now there was something underneath it, not authority, verification. The man closed the wallet. My name isn't the important part, he said, a pause. What matters is the division I represent. Silence, because now the room was listening differently, and so was the judge. The Regional Oversight Division, the man said. No emphasis, no theatrics, just placement. And that was enough. Because now, the document wasn't just real, it was present, in the room. Judge Vance leaned back slowly. I see, he said, but he didn't, not fully. Not yet. Then I assume you're here to observe, the judge added. That would have made sense. It would have kept things contained, manageable, predictable. But the man shook his head slightly. No, one word, and the room felt it. I'm here because observation ended 2 weeks ago. That was the 8th problem. Because now, this wasn't passive. It wasn't preliminary. It wasn't quiet. It had moved forward. Judge Vance's fingers tightened against the bench. And what exactly does that mean? He asked. The man glanced briefly at Carter, just for a second, then back to the judge. It means this courtroom is no longer under informal review. A pause. It's under active evaluation. No one spoke, no one moved, because now everything that had happened in the last 15 minutes was part of something official, something recorded, something moving beyond this room. Judge Vance exhaled slowly. And you're declaring that in open court? The man didn't hesitate. Yes. That answer, simple as it was, closed something and opened something else at the same time. The judge looked at Carter again, and for the first time, he didn't see a defendant. He saw placement, strategy, design. "You orchestrated this," the judge said, not loud, but sharp. Carter shook his head slightly. "No," he said. A pause. "I followed it." That was the ninth problem. Because now, this wasn't about control. It was about inevitability. And inevitability is something authority can't negotiate with. The judge leaned forward again, but this time, there was no performance left, only pressure. "What happens next?" he asked. The man from the division answered, not Carter. "Now," he said, a brief pause. "Now we see how far it goes." And that line, quiet as it was, didn't end the moment. It extended it, beyond the courtroom, beyond the case, beyond the judge, because somewhere, in other cities, in other courtrooms, in other quiet proceedings just like this one, the same question was being asked. At the same time, and not all of them, would end quietly. The room didn't breathe the same after that. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something more precise, awareness. Because once something becomes official, people stop pretending they don't see it. Judge Vance sat motionless, but the stillness no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the moment, to the weight now pressing down on every word that had already been spoken, every reaction, every interruption, every dismissal. And somewhere in that silence, a quiet realization settled in. This wasn't about what was going to happen next. It was about what had already happened. The judge's voice came slower this time, measured differently. "This court operates within the bounds of the law," he said. It sounded right. It always did. But now, it sounded like a statement meant to be remembered. The man from the Regional Oversight Division nodded slightly. "We're aware." That response didn't challenge the statement. It didn't contradict it. It bypassed it. And that was the 10th problem, because now they weren't debating legality. They were evaluating behavior. And behavior doesn't hide behind statutes the same way. Judge Vance looked at the clerk, then at the bailiff, then back at Carter, recentering, trying to find something still under his control. "This proceeding is still active," he said, "and I will complete it." That mattered to him, not just as authority, but as structure, because finishing something meant containing it. But Carter spoke again, one sentence, quiet. "You already have." The judge's eyes snapped back to him. "What does that mean?" Carter didn't answer immediately, because now every word needed to land clean. "It means the decision point wasn't the ruling," he said. A pause. It was the acknowledgement. Silence. Because that word, acknowledgement, had already been spoken. And now, it had weight. The man from the division stepped slightly closer. Not interrupting, not taking over, but present. Because this part mattered. "The formal process doesn't begin when a report is written," he said calmly. "It begins when awareness is confirmed." Judge Vance didn't move, but his jaw tightened again. "That's an internal interpretation," he said, "not a legal standard." The man nodded. "That's correct." Another pause. "But it's not internal anymore." That line didn't raise his voice. It didn't need to. Because now, this wasn't contained. The courtroom door opened quietly. No one had noticed it at first, because the focus had been forward, on the bench, on Carter, on the man from the division. But now, movement behind them. 2 more individuals entered, not rushed, not disruptive, just precise. One carried a thin case file, the other a tablet. They didn't speak. They didn't announce themselves. They simply positioned near the side wall and waited. That was the 11th problem, because now this wasn't one representative. It was a process, already in motion, already expanding. Judge Vance saw them, and something inside him shifted again, not uncertainty this time, recognition, because he had seen this before, not here, not in this courtroom, but in reports, in briefings, in cases that didn't stay local, cases that moved, cases that escalated, cases that didn't stop. The judge exhaled slowly, then straightened, not defensively, but deliberately. If this is an escalation, he said, then it will proceed through the appropriate channels. That was the right response, on paper, procedurally sound, controlled, but Carter tilted his head slightly. It already has, he said, and there it was again, that quiet inevitability, because this wasn't being initiated. It had already been initiated. They were just late to it. The clerk looked down at the documents again. But now, she wasn't reading them as records. She was seeing them as evidence. And that changed everything. The bailiff shifted his stance again, not guarding the room anymore, guarding the process, because now this wasn't about maintaining order. It was about preserving what had just happened, exactly as it happened. The man from the division glanced at Carter once more. A brief exchange, unspoken, but understood. Then he turned back to the judge. "There's one more thing," he said, and that line, quiet as it was, pulled the entire room forward again. Because by now, everyone understood nothing introduced in this room was accidental. Judge Vance didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because whatever came next was coming regardless. The man gestured slightly toward the clerk. "The timestamp on your acknowledgement," he said, "has already been logged." A pause. And transmitted. The room didn't react loudly, but something deeper settled in. Because that meant this wasn't just recorded. It was already somewhere else. Beyond correction, beyond revision, beyond control. Judge Vance's fingers pressed into the bench again, harder this time. "And where exactly was it transmitted to?" he asked. The man didn't hesitate. "A review board." A pause. Multi-jurisdictional. That was the 12th problem. Because now, this wasn't local. It wasn't contained to one courtroom, one judge, one city. This was part of something larger, something connected, something coordinated, and somewhere in that realization, a final piece clicked into place. Because Carter had never once tried to defend himself. Not really. He hadn't argued the citations. He hadn't negotiated penalties. He hadn't asked for leniency. He had only done one thing. He had aligned a sequence and waited for the system to reveal itself. The judge looked at him again, longer this time, and now, for the first time, there was no misreading it, no dismissal, no underestimation, only recognition. "You knew this would happen," the judge said. Carter shook his head slightly. "No," he said. A pause. "I knew it already had." And that, more than anything else, was the moment the courtroom lost control. Not loudly, not visibly, but completely. Because control had never been inside the room. It had been watching it, measuring it, waiting for it. And now, it had moved on, but not finished. Not even close. Because as the man from the division turned slightly, preparing to step back, he said one final thing. Not to the judge, not to the clerk, not even to Carter, but to the room itself. "There are 4 more courts under review this week." A pause. And 2 of them already responded. Silence. Because that meant this wasn't isolated. It wasn't rare. It was happening. Everywhere. At the same time. And not all of them were handling it the same way. The words didn't echo. They settled. Heavy. Quiet. permanent. 4 more courts, 2 already responded. No one asked how, no one asked what that meant, because everyone in that room understood something instinctively. If this was being said out loud, then whatever those responses were, they weren't minor. Judge Vance didn't speak right away. For the first time since the session began, he allowed silence to exist without controlling it, and that alone said more than anything else, because this wasn't hesitation anymore. It was recalibration. He looked down at the bench, not at the files, not at the documents, at the surface itself, as if trying to find something familiar again, something stable. But the structure hadn't changed, only the context had, and that made it harder. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, not weaker, but stripped. "Then this isn't about enforcement errors," he said. The man from the division didn't answer immediately, because this question, this one, mattered. It was the first real attempt to define the situation correctly, and definitions shape outcomes. "No," the man said calmly. A pause. "It's about consistency." That word landed deeper than anything else so far. Consistency. Because inconsistency can be explained, but consistency requires intention. Judge Vance leaned back slowly. "And you believe there's intent here?" The man tilted his head slightly. "We don't operate on belief." A pause. "We operate on accumulation." That was the 13th problem. Because accumulation doesn't argue. It builds quietly, relentlessly, until it doesn't need interpretation anymore. The clerk shifted again. But this time, she didn't look at the documents. She looked at the judge, and that was new, because before, everyone in this room had followed his lead. Now, they were watching him, waiting, evaluating, the same way he had evaluated others for years. Judge Vance noticed. Of course he did. And for a brief moment, something crossed his expression. Not panic, not fear, recognition of what this felt like. From the other side, Carter remained still. He hadn't moved in several minutes because his role was no longer active. He had already done what he came to do. Now, he was simply part of the record. The man from the division stepped slightly to the side, not retreating, just clearing the center, because now the focus had shifted again. Back to the bench, back to the decision. But not the decision the judge thought he was making, a different one that didn't involve fines or compliance or property violations, one that involved response, reaction, conduct. Judge Vance leaned forward again, slowly, deliberately. "This court will recess for review," he said. There it was, a move, not an ending, but a pause, a controlled one, and under normal circumstances, that would have been enough. But these weren't normal circumstances, because the man from the division shook his head, just slightly. "Recess has already been noted," he said. A pause. "Continuation is optional." Silence. Because that sentence, quiet as it was, changed the meaning of everything. The judge didn't respond immediately, because now he understood something critical. This wasn't about whether he continued the session. It was about how he chose to. Every word now was part of something larger, something recorded, something compared, something measured. Against other judges, in other courtrooms, facing the same moment, the same pressure, the same choice, the same line, and not all of them were making the same decision. Judge Vance's eyes moved slowly across the room, the clerk, the bailiff, the additional observers by the wall, the man from the division, and finally, Carter, still calm, still steady, still exactly the same as when this began. That consistency, that unshaken presence, it stood out now more than anything else, because everything else had changed. The judge exhaled. then spoke. "This court acknowledges the procedural concerns raised," he said, "measured, clear, careful, and will submit all relevant documentation for external review." A pause. "And pending that review," another pause. "The enforcement action in this case is suspended." Silence. Because that was the first true shift. Not defensive, not dismissive, not controlling, responsive. And that mattered. More than anyone in the room could fully measure yet. The man from the division nodded once. No approval, no praise, just acknowledgement. Because this wasn't about being right. It was about what happened next. Carter gave a small nod as well. Not victory, not relief, just confirmation. The sequence had moved. Judge Vance leaned back again, but this time, the movement wasn't about control. It was about acceptance, not of fault, not yet, but of position. And that was enough. For now. Because as the room began to shift again, papers moving, chairs adjusting, breaths returning, something remained, unresolved, unfinished. Because this wasn't the only courtroom. It wasn't the only judge. It wasn't the only pattern. And somewhere, in another city, in another room, someone else was reaching the same moment. But not all of them would respond the same way. And that difference would matter. A lot. The courtroom began to move again, but not back to normal. That was the difference. People gathered papers, adjusted chairs, exchanged quiet glances. But the rhythm was gone. The familiar sequence of closing a case, clearing the room, and resetting for the next hearing. It didn't return. Because no one believed this was over. Judge Vance remained seated. He didn't rise, didn't signal adjournment, didn't reach for the next file. That alone held the room in place. Because now, everyone understood this wasn't just a suspended case. It was a marked moment. The clerk looked down at the record again, but her hands didn't move, because she knew every word from the last 20 minutes mattered more than anything she had typed all week. The bailiff stepped slightly closer to the bench, not out of duty, out of instinct, and in the background, the two additional observers had already begun working, quietly. The one with the tablet was reviewing timestamps, scrolling, cross-referencing. The one with the case file was flipping pages slowly, not searching, confirming, because they weren't gathering information, they were validating it. And that distinction changed everything. Carter remained where he was, still, unmoved. But now, he wasn't the focus. He was part of the record, which meant what happened next didn't require him. Judge Vance finally spoke again. "Clerk," he said, voice steady but different. "Yes, Your Honor. Ensure that all materials submitted today are duplicated and forwarded." A pause. "To the appropriate review channels." The clerk nodded, but there was something in her expression now, not hesitation, awareness. Because this wasn't a routine instruction. This was alignment. The judge wasn't resisting anymore. He was cooperating. And that was the 14th shift. The man from the Regional Oversight Division observed it quietly. No reaction, no acknowledgement, because cooperation didn't end the process. It just changed its direction. Judge Vance rested his hands flat on the bench. "Is there anything further required at this time?" he asked. The question was formal, but the meaning wasn't. It wasn't about procedure anymore. It was about position. The man from the division considered it for a moment, then shook his head slightly. "Not from you." That answer landed carefully, not dismissive, not authoritative, just accurate. Because the next steps weren't his to control anymore, and everyone in the room understood that. A quiet shift came from the side wall. The observer with the tablet stepped forward, just one step, then stopped. "Transmission confirmed," they said. Simple, neutral, but final. Because now, everything that had happened here was no longer contained in this room. Judge Vance closed his eyes, briefly, just for a second, not fatigue, not avoidance, processing. Then he opened them again, clear, present. "This session is concluded," he said. And this time, it wasn't a declaration of control. It was a recognition of completion. The bailiff nodded. "Court is adjourned." But even that sounded different, because adjournment usually meant closure. And this wasn't that. People began to stand, slowly, not rushing for the exit, not eager to leave, because something told them. This moment mattered, more than most. Carter finally moved, just one step back, then another, collecting nothing, leaving everything behind, because he hadn't brought anything that needed to leave. The folder stayed on the table, deliberately. Because it was no longer his, it belonged to the process now. As he turned, his eyes moved once more toward the back of the room. But the man who had been sitting there earlier was gone. No exit, no announcement, just absence, as if he had never been there. But Carter knew better, because that man had never been part of the room. He had been part of something else, something higher, something that didn't sit. It observed and moved, quietly, beyond visibility. Carter walked toward the aisle, passing the man from the division. No words exchanged, none needed, because everything that needed to be said had already been recorded. As he reached the doors, he paused, just briefly, not turning around, just standing there, because something else had just aligned. Not in the room, outside it, beyond it, and far from this courthouse, in a different city, in a different courtroom. Another judge had just made a different decision, one that didn't pause, one that didn't acknowledge, one that didn't shift. And somewhere, that decision was being logged too, compared, measured, added to the same growing system, the same expanding pattern, the same quiet accumulation. Carter stepped through the doors, and just like that, he disappeared into the hallway, calm, unnoticed, unremarkable, exactly as he had arrived, but not unknown, not anymore. Because inside systems that didn't speak publicly, that didn't announce themselves, that didn't move loudly, his presence was no longer a question, it was a signal. And now, that signal had been sent again, in another city, in another courtroom, on another record. And it wouldn't be the last, because what happened in that room wasn't an ending. It was a threshold. And somewhere, far above all of it, someone was watching the pattern grow, waiting for it to reach something bigger, something higher, something that hadn't been touched yet, but would be soon. The hallway outside the courtroom carried a different kind of silence, not the structured quiet of proceedings, not the controlled stillness of authority. This silence moved. It followed people as they walked, clung to conversations that almost started, but didn't, lingered in the spaces between footsteps. Carter stepped into it without hesitation, as if he had walked this exact corridor before, not this building, not this city, but this moment. Because the architecture didn't matter. The pattern did. Behind him, the courtroom doors closed softly. No slam, no finality, just a quiet separation. And already, what happened inside was no longer contained there. Two individuals exited moments later. The observers, one still holding the tablet, the other, the file. They didn't look at Carter. They didn't acknowledge him. But their pace adjusted. Not to catch up, not to follow, to align, because now they were part of the same movement. Down the hallway, a security camera turned slightly. almost imperceptibly. Tracking, not unusual, but today it mattered. Carter reached the end of the corridor and turned left, toward a quieter wing of the building. Administrative offices, unused conference rooms, doors that stayed closed more often than open. Halfway down, he stopped. Not because someone called out, not because something blocked his path, because the timing was exact. A door opened, not abruptly, not slowly, precisely, and the man from the back row stepped out, the same one who had disappeared before the session ended. Now, he wasn't in the shadows. Now, he was positioned. "You stayed," Carter said. It wasn't a question. The man gave a small nod. I needed to see how he responded. Carter leaned slightly against the wall. And a pause. He adjusted. That answer carried weight, not approval, assessment, because adjustment meant awareness, and awareness changed the trajectory, but didn't stop it. "Not all of them do," Carter said. The man's expression didn't change. "I know." Silence settled between them, not empty, full, because both of them understood. This wasn't the only courtroom. It wasn't even the most important one. "What happened in Brighton?" Carter asked. The man's eyes shifted slightly. "Escalated," he said. One word, but it carried more than explanation. "Refusal?" Carter asked. The man nodded once. "Complete." Carter exhaled slowly, because that aligned with what he had expected, not hoped. Expected. "And the board?" Carter asked. "They're already reviewing it." Of course they were, because the system didn't wait. It moved, quietly, continuously. And once something entered it, it didn't leave. The man stepped slightly closer. "You didn't push him," he said. Not a question, an observation. Carter shook his head. "No." "Why?" A small pause. "Because he was already at the edge." The man considered that, then nodded. "Because that was the method, not force, position. Let the system reveal itself. Let the pressure exist without being applied, because pressure, when recognized, becomes choice. And choice is what gets recorded." Footsteps echoed faintly from the far end of the hallway. Someone approaching, not hurried, not cautious, expected. Carter didn't turn. Neither did the man, because they already knew who it was. The man from the Regional Oversight Division entered the corridor. Alone. No documents, no devices, just presence. "It's moving faster now," he said. No greeting, no introduction, just continuation. Carter nodded. "How many confirmed?" he asked. The man paused, then 6. The number landed heavier than the others, because earlier it had been 4, with 2 responses. Now it was 6, and growing. "That leaves," Carter started. 3 unresponsive," the man finished. Silence. Because unresponsive didn't mean inactive. It meant something else, something less predictable. "Locations?" Carter asked. The man hesitated. Not long, just enough to acknowledge the weight of the answer. "Seattle." A beat. "Richmond," another. "And Phoenix." Carter nodded slowly, because now the pattern wasn't just forming, it was spreading, geographically, structurally, systemically. "And above them?" Carter asked. The man's expression didn't change, but his eyes shifted slightly. Upward. Not physically, structurally. Still quiet. That was the 15th problem. Because the higher it went, the quieter it got. And silence at that level was never empty. It was waiting. The man from the back row stepped away from the wall. "We're close," he said. Not hopeful. Certain. But Carter didn't respond right away, because close was a dangerous word. Close to what? Exposure? Intervention? Containment? All 3? Not yet, Carter said finally. A pause. They're still watching. The man from the division nodded. Of course they are. Because that was the final layer. Not the courts, not the judges, not even the regional boards. Something above all of it. Something that hadn't moved yet. Something that didn't appear in documents, didn't sign off on reviews, didn't enter rooms, but influenced all of them. And that was what they were really approaching. The footsteps from earlier grew louder, then passed. A courthouse employee, unaware, uninvolved, unimportant to the system unfolding around them. The moment remained contained, quiet, precise. Carter pushed off the wall. It'll surface, he said. Not if, when. The man from the back row nodded. It always does. The man from the division looked between them. And when it does, Carter didn't hesitate. Then it won't be about courtrooms anymore. Silence, because that line meant something bigger, something beyond local authority, beyond regional oversight, beyond patterns. It meant exposure at a level that didn't get contained, didn't get redirected, didn't get buried. And somewhere, far from that hallway, in a place none of them could see, something shifted, not visibly, not publicly, but internally, because the pattern had reached it. And now, for the first time, it was aware of them. Awareness didn't arrive like noise. It didn't announce itself. It didn't interrupt. It settled. Somewhere far above the systems they could see, beyond courtrooms, beyond oversight divisions, beyond regional boards. Something registered the pattern, not as an alert, not as a threat, as a deviation. And deviations at that level don't get ignored. They get tracked. Back in the hallway, nothing outwardly changed. No alarms, no urgency, no sudden movement. But the air shifted again, not heavier this time, sharper, because something had just moved, without anyone in that building seeing it happen. Carter felt it first, not physically, not instinctively, structurally. He had seen this stage before. Not here, not with this configuration, but enough times to recognize the moment. They've marked it, he said quietly. The man from the division didn't ask who. He didn't need to. How long? He asked instead. Carter thought for a second. Not long. A pause. They won't respond directly. That was important, because direct responses could be tracked, measured, challenged. But indirect responses, those were different. They reshaped things quietly, without ever appearing in the record. The man from the back row stepped closer. Then we're past observation, he said. Carter nodded. Yes. Another pause. We've been past it. That confirmation settled between them, because it meant everything happening now was already part of something active, something moving beyond their control. The man from the division exhaled slowly. They'll test the edges, he said. Not here. Carter shook his head. No. A glance down the hallway. Somewhere less visible. That was the 16th problem. Because visibility was protection. And the moment something moved outside of it, it became harder to follow, harder to prove, harder to stop. The door behind them opened again. This time, it was Judge Vance. No robe, no bench, just a man. And for a moment, no one spoke. Because this version of him was different. Not stripped of authority, but separated from it. He looked at Carter first, then at the two men beside him. You didn't tell me everything, the judge said. Not accusing, not defensive, just accurate. Carter met his gaze. No, he said. A pause. Because everything wasn't needed. The judge nodded slightly. He understood that now, more than he had 30 minutes ago. What happens to my court? He asked. That question mattered. Because now It wasn't about him. It was about the system around him. The man from the division answered. It continues. A pause, but differently. Judge Vance absorbed that, because differently could mean a lot of things. Oversight, restriction, monitoring, or something else entirely. And me? The judge asked. Silence, not long, but deliberate, because that answer was still forming. Depends, Carter said. The judge looked at him. On what? Carter didn't hesitate. What you do next? That landed clean, because for the first time, the judge wasn't reacting to the system. He was part of its next step, and that was new. The man from the back row spoke. There will be follow-up, he said. Interviews, requests, reviews. The judge nodded. I expected that, but Carter tilted his head slightly. That's not the part that matters. The judge's eyes narrowed. Then what does? A pause. The part you won't be asked about. Silence, because that was harder. The unrecorded, the unprompted, the choices made when no one was watching, except now someone was, always. The man from the division stepped back slightly. We'll be in contact, he said. Standard, expected, but the weight behind it was anything but routine. The two observers down the hall began to move again, packing, closing files, finalizing something unseen. Judge Vance looked at Carter one last time. You said this wasn't the only place, he said. Carter nodded. It isn't. How many? A pause. Enough. That answer didn't give clarity. It gave scale, and scale was harder to ignore. The judge exhaled slowly, then gave a small nod. Not agreement, not acceptance, recognition. And that was enough. For now. He turned, walked back toward the courtroom doors, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate. Because whatever happened next, he understood now, wouldn't be decided in a single moment. It would be decided over time, across actions, across choices, across patterns. The same way everything else had been. Carter watched him go, then turned toward the exit. The man from the division fell in step beside him. The man from the back row stayed behind, still watching. Because someone always stayed, at every site, in every city, in every pattern. As Carter reached the building's exit, he pushed the door open. Sunlight spilled in, bright, unfiltered, normal, completely disconnected from what had just happened inside. But that contrast was the point. Because systems like this don't live in the open. They live just beneath it. And now, they were moving closer to the surface. As Carter stepped outside, he didn't look back, because he didn't need to. The sequence behind him was complete. But the system ahead of him was just beginning to respond, and somewhere, far above all of it, something had stopped watching passively and started deciding. Decision didn't arrive like action. It didn't move through doors, didn't enter hallways, didn't stand in courtrooms. It adjusted conditions. Somewhere far above the structure Carter had been navigating, a layer shifted. Quietly, without record, without signature. And that shift didn't target the courtroom. It didn't target the judge. It didn't even target Carter. It targeted the pattern itself. Because patterns, when left alone, grow. And growth at scale becomes visibility. That couldn't happen. Not yet. Outside, the courthouse steps were ordinary. People moved in and out without hesitation. Phones in hand, conversations half finished, schedules uninterrupted. No one knew. And that was by design. Carter paused at the bottom of the steps, not stopping, not waiting, just adjusting pace, because something had changed, not in front of him, around him. The man from the division noticed it too. They're redirecting, he said quietly. Carter nodded. Of course they are. Because escalation was only one response. Containment was another. And containment didn't look like resistance. It looked like silence, like delays, like processes that slowed without explanation, like doors that didn't open when they should, like approvals that didn't arrive, like patterns that suddenly stopped aligning. "That means we're close," the man said. Carter glanced at him briefly. "No," he said. A pause. "It means they are." That distinction mattered, because proximity wasn't measured by effort. It was measured by reaction, and something had just reacted. Across the street, a black vehicle sat idling, unmarked, unremarkable, but not random. Carter didn't look at it directly. He didn't need to, because now he understood something clearly. They weren't just tracking the pattern anymore. They were mapping the people inside it. "Do we move?" the man from the division asked. Carter shook his head. "No sudden changes." A pause. "That's what they're waiting for. Because sudden movement creates signals, and signals can be followed." Instead, Carter stepped forward, normal pace, normal posture, crossing the street with everyone else, blending, because invisibility wasn't about hiding. It was about not disrupting the flow. Halfway across, a car passed, too fast for the area, but not fast enough to draw attention. Except it did. Not from the crowd, from Carter. Because he wasn't watching speed. He was watching timing, and that car had adjusted. By seconds, the man beside him noticed Carter's shift. "What is it?" Carter didn't answer immediately, because now he needed to be certain. They reached the other side of the street, and as they stepped onto the sidewalk, Carter spoke. "They're not just observing anymore." The man's expression tightened slightly. "They're testing." That was the 17th problem. Because tests don't announce themselves. They measure reactions, pressure points, decision timing, behavior under uncertainty. "On us?" the man asked. Carter nodded. "Yes." A pause. "And others?" Because this wasn't isolated. Nothing about this was. Every city, every courtroom, every decision, part of the same structure, part of the same evaluation. The black vehicle across the street pulled away, smooth, unhurried, gone within seconds. But not gone, not really. Because now, it didn't need to be seen. It had already collected what it needed. Carter continued walking. No change in direction, no hesitation, because reacting now would confirm too much. "They'll escalate differently," he said. "How?" the man asked. Carter thought for a moment. "Not through the courts." A pause. "Through pressure." That word landed differently, because pressure doesn't need authority. It works around it, through institutions, through access, through influence, and most importantly, through absence, removing support, delaying action, redirecting focus, making things harder to connect. "They'll try to fragment it," the man said. Carter nodded. "Yes, because a pattern only exists when it's visible. Break the visibility, and the pattern disappears, even if it's still happening." They turned a corner. Quieter street. Less movement, more distance between people, more space for something to happen. Or not happen. And that uncertainty was the point. Carter slowed slightly, then stopped. Not abruptly, just enough. The man beside him stopped too. "What is it?" he asked. Carter looked ahead, at nothing specific, just the space in front of them. "They're waiting for a mistake," he said. A pause. "We don't give them one." Silence. Because now, the rules had changed, not officially, not visibly, but structurally. This wasn't about exposing the system anymore. The system had noticed. Now, it was about surviving the response. And somewhere, Far above all of it, a decision finalized. Not written, not announced, but executed, quietly, across multiple points, at once. And the next phase wouldn't look like resistance. It would look like nothing at all. Until it was too late, nothing changed. That was how it started. No alerts, no sudden interference, no visible obstruction. The street remained quiet. The air remained still. The city continued exactly as it had been. And that was the 18th problem. Because when systems respond at that level, they don't disrupt. They remove. Not people, not immediately. They remove connections. Carter started walking again, slow, measured. The man beside him followed. "Where are we going?" he asked. Carter didn't answer right away. Because direction was no longer the priority. Sequence was. "Forward," he said finally. A simple answer. But it carried weight. Because forward didn't mean destination, it meant continuation. And continuation was exactly what the system would try to interrupt. They moved another block. Nothing unusual. No one watching, no one following, no one even noticing. And yet, something was off. The man from the division felt it now too. "The signal dropped," he said quietly. Carter didn't stop. "I know." That was fast, too fast, because systems like theirs didn't fail without reason. "What kind of drop?" the man asked. Carter reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, looked at it briefly. "Not failure," he said. A pause. Delay. That distinction mattered. Failure meant something broke. Delay meant something was holding it, and holding required intent. The man's expression shifted. "They're filtering." Carter nodded. "Selective routing." That was the 19th problem, because now information wasn't being stopped. It was being shaped. What arrived, when it arrived, how it connected. All controlled. "Can we bypass it?" the man asked. Carter shook his head. "Not directly." Another pause. "Not without showing them where we are." Silence. Because that was the trap. Force a response and reveal position. Stay still and lose connection. Either way, they gained something. Carter slipped the phone back into his pocket. "They're mapping behavior now," he said, "not just patterns." The man exhaled slowly. "That's a different level." Yes, and it meant something critical. This wasn't about stopping the investigation anymore. It was about understanding the people driving it, how they moved, how they reacted, how they adapted. Because once you understand behavior, you can predict it. And once you can predict it, you can control it. They reached another intersection, this one busier, more people, more noise, better cover, or worse, depending on how you looked at it. Carter slowed again, then stepped into the crosswalk. Not because the signal changed, because the timing did. The man followed. Halfway across, a notification appeared on Carter's phone. He didn't check it immediately. That would have been instinct, and instinct was exactly what they were measuring. Instead, he waited. 3 steps, 4, 5. Then, he looked. The message was short. 1 line, no sender, no identifier, just text. "Sequence incomplete." The man beside him saw the shift in Carter's expression. "What is it?" Carter turned the screen slightly. The man read it, and his posture changed instantly. "That's not from our system." "No," Carter said. A pause. "It's from theirs." That was the 20th problem, because now the system wasn't just observing, it was communicating directly, and that meant they had crossed a threshold, not fully, but enough. The light changed. They stepped onto the sidewalk. Carter stopped, this time fully, because now continuing without adjusting would be a mistake. They're pushing, the man said. Carter nodded. Yes. A pause. They want to see how we respond. Because response was the only thing left to measure. Everything else they already had. The man looked around. Nothing. No one paying attention. No visible threat. And that was exactly the point. So what do we do? He asked. Carter didn't answer immediately. Because now, the next move mattered more than anything so far. Not for the courtroom, not for the case, but for everything beyond it. The system was no longer passive. It was engaged. And engaged systems don't give second chances. Carter looked at the message again. Sequence incomplete. He exhaled slowly. Then, he did something unexpected. He turned off his phone. Completely. The man beside him frowned. That cuts us off, Carter nodded. Yes. A pause. That's the point. Silence. Because disconnecting wasn't retreat. It was control. They couldn't track the signal. They couldn't shape it, at least not directly. The man hesitated. Then he did the same. Phone off. Pocket. Now they were moving without a digital trace, but that didn't mean they weren't being tracked. It just meant tracking became harder, less precise, less immediate. And in systems like this, even a few seconds of uncertainty mattered. Carter looked down the street, then chose a direction. Not the fastest, not the shortest, the least predictable. Now we move, he said. And this time, it meant something different. Because now, they weren't following the sequence. They were protecting it. And somewhere, far above them, the system registered the change. A small deviation, but enough. Enough to adjust again. Enough to escalate again, enough to begin something. That hadn't been used in a long time. And when that layer activated, it wouldn't test, it would act. And by the time anyone realized it, the pattern wouldn't just be hidden, it would be gone. Gone didn't mean erased. That was the mistake most people made. Nothing at that level was ever truly erased. It was displaced, moved, rewritten into something harder to recognize. Carter understood that, which is why he didn't speed up, didn't change direction abruptly, didn't look back, because panic creates patterns, and patterns could now be read. The street stretched ahead, ordinary in every way that mattered, storefronts, muted conversations, a delivery truck idling too long at the curb. Normal, but normal was no longer neutral. They expected us to disconnect, the man beside him said quietly. Carter nodded. Yes. Then we just confirmed something. Another nod. Yes. Silence. Because confirmation cuts both ways. The system learned from them, but they learned from it too. They escalated faster than Brighton, the man added. Carter's eyes moved slightly, not scanning, not searching, measuring. Brighton resisted, he said. A pause. We adapted. That was the difference. Resistance creates friction. Adaptation creates uncertainty. And uncertainty was harder to control. They turned down another street. Quieter, narrower, less movement, more shadow. The kind of place where things either happened or didn't. Halfway down, Carter slowed again, not stopping, adjusting. Because something didn't fit. Not visually, structurally. A door on the left, slightly open, not unusual except the timing was wrong. The man beside him noticed Carter's shift. You see it? Carter nodded once. Yes. A pause. They're early. That was the 21st problem, because early meant they weren't reacting anymore. They were anticipating, which meant they had enough data, enough pattern, enough behavior mapped to move ahead of them. The man's voice dropped slightly. Do we avoid it? Carter didn't answer immediately, because avoidance was also a signal, and signals were what they were trying to minimize. No, he said finally. A pause. We pass it. Not confront, not engage, not ignore. Pass, because passing kept the sequence intact. They continued forward, step by step, even pace, no hesitation. As they drew closer, the door moved, just slightly, not opening, not closing, adjusting, and then a voice. Mr. Carter. Calm, precise, expected. Carter didn't stop, didn't turn, just enough to acknowledge he heard it. The man beside him tensed slightly. Carter didn't, because tension was another signal. We don't need to do this here, the voice continued, still calm, still controlled, still unseen. Carter kept walking. Then you shouldn't have started it here, he replied. No change in tone, no hesitation, just placement. The door opened a little wider, but no one stepped out. We're offering you a correction, the voice said. That word, correction, landed carefully. Not threat, not warning, something else. Carter shook his head slightly as he walked. No, he said, a pause. You're offering a deviation. Silence. Because that word cut deeper. Deviation implies the original path matters, and they were trying to change it. Sequence incomplete, the voice said again. This time, out loud, not through a screen, not through a system, direct. That was the 20-second problem, because now they had moved into physical space, which meant the system had escalated again. Carter stopped, not because of the voice, because of the timing. Then, slowly, he turned. The man beside him stayed still, watching, ready, but not reacting, because this moment required precision. Carter looked at the doorway, still shadowed, still unclear. Then, you're missing something, Carter said, calm, measured, because now the conversation wasn't about control. It was about understanding. What are we missing? The voice asked. Carter held the silence for a second, then, the sequence doesn't end with us. That line landed differently, because it shifted the frame away from them to something larger, something ongoing, something they couldn't fully stop. Another pause, longer this time, because now the system had to process something new, not resistance, not avoidance, expansion. That's not your decision, the voice said. Carter nodded slightly. You're right. A pause. It's already been made. Silence. Because that answer removed control, not aggressively, but completely. And that was dangerous for both sides. The door didn't move again. The voice didn't respond immediately, because now it wasn't testing reaction. It was recalculating position. Carter turned back and continued walking. No rush, no hesitation, because stopping longer would give them more data, and data was what they were trying to limit. The man beside him followed. They passed the door, step by step. Nothing happened. No one stepped out. No one followed. No sound behind them. But that didn't mean it was over. It meant something else, something quieter, something more controlled. Because as they reached the end of the street, Carter spoke again. They've moved past testing. The man nodded. Yes. A pause. So what's next? Carter looked ahead, then slightly upward, not at anything visible, at structure. Now, he said, they start removing variables. Silence. Because that was the final shift. Not observation, not testing, not even control, simplification. And in systems like this, simplification meant one thing. Anything that couldn't be predicted would be eliminated. And somewhere, far above all of it, a list had just been updated, not with names, not exactly, with positions, connections, points in a pattern. And one of those points had just been highlighted. Highlighted points don't disappear immediately. That would be obvious. They get isolated first, separated from the rest of the pattern. quietly. So when they finally do disappear, it doesn't disrupt anything. Carter felt that shift the moment they turned the corner. The street ahead was open. Too open, not empty, but arranged, spacing between people slightly wider, movement slightly slower, sound slightly dampened, none of it obvious, but all of it intentional. "They've segmented the space," Carter said. The man beside him scanned subtly. "I see it." Because once you knew what to look for, you couldn't unsee it. The distance, the pacing, the way no one crossed too close, like an invisible perimeter had been drawn, without anyone knowing it existed. "That's not for containment," the man said. Carter nodded. "No, a pause. It's for clarity." That was the 23rd problem, because clarity meant clean data, no interference, no noise, just observation of a single variable, them. They kept walking, same pace, same posture, because breaking that now would confirm the segmentation. At the end of the block, a figure stepped into view, not from hiding, not from shadow, from alignment, as if he had always been there. Mid-50s, neutral suit, no badge, no visible identifier, but presence that didn't need one. The man stopped in the center of the sidewalk, not blocking, positioning. Carter slowed, then stopped. The man beside him did the same, because this was no longer something to pass. This was engagement. "You've accelerated faster than expected," the man said. His voice was calm, controlled, but not neutral. There was something underneath it. Assessment. Carter didn't respond immediately, because this voice was different, not field level, not regional, higher. "You adjusted slower than expected," Carter replied. Same tone, same control, no escalation, just alignment. The man's expression didn't change. "That's intentional." Of course it was, because at that level, nothing moved without intention. Silence settled between them, not tense, precise, because now every word mattered. The man took a single step forward. "You've reached a threshold," he said. There it was, not implied, not hidden, declared. Carter nodded slightly. "I know." A pause. "And you're responding." The man tilted his head. "We're refining." That word, refining, was more dangerous than escalation, because escalation is visible. Refinement happens underneath. The man glanced briefly at the one beside Carter. "Secondary variable," he said. Not a question, a classification. The man beside Carter didn't react, because reacting would confirm it. Carter stepped slightly forward, just enough to shift the focus back. "No," he said. A pause. "Parallel sequence." That correction landed, because it changed the structure. Not secondary. Equal. The man considered that, then nodded once. "Noted." Which meant it would be updated. Immediately, every word here was being processed in real time, not recorded in files, integrated into a system. "Sequence incomplete," the man said again. But this time, it wasn't a test. It was a statement. Carter shook his head. "No," he said. A pause. "You're just seeing the wrong endpoint." Silence, because that challenged something fundamental, not control, not authority, perspective. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what is the correct endpoint?" Carter held his gaze, then answered. "You." That was the 24th problem, because now the pattern wasn't pointing downward. It was pointing up, directly at them, for the first time. The man's posture shifted, not dramatically, but enough, because that wasn't supposed to happen. The system wasn't supposed to be the end point. It was supposed to remain outside it, above it, untouched by it. But Carter had just placed it inside, and that changed everything. "That's not how this works," the man said. Carter nodded, It is now. Silence. Longer this time. Because now, the system had to do something it wasn't designed to do. Consider itself. And systems like this don't do that easily. The man took another step forward, close enough now that the separation between them mattered. "You're forcing convergence," he said. Carter shook his head. "No." A pause. "I'm revealing it." That distinction was critical, because convergence implies action. Revelation implies it was already there, hidden, waiting. The man exhaled slowly. Then something changed, subtle but undeniable. The tone shifted, not in volume, in intent. "This is where it stops," he said. No anger, no threat, just certainty. Carter didn't move, didn't react, because he had been waiting for that line. And when it came, he already knew what it meant. "No," Carter said quietly. A pause. "This is where it becomes visible." Silence. Because that was the line the system couldn't allow. Visibility, exposure, connection. Everything it had been built to avoid. The man held his gaze. Then, for the first time, he didn't respond. Because there was no immediate response available, only decision. And that decision was no longer happening here. It was happening somewhere else, above, beyond. And as that decision finalized, something shifted again. Not in the street, not in the air, in the structure itself, because the system had reached its own threshold. And when systems reach that point, they don't adjust. They act. The man stepped back, not retreating, clearing. "Then we'll see," he said. And that line, quiet as it was, carried finality. Because now, the next move wouldn't be measured. It would be executed, and by the time it was visible, it would already be too late to stop. Carter didn't follow, didn't respond, because now there was nothing left to say, only what came next. And somewhere, far above all of it, the system moved, not to observe, not to test, but to close. Closing didn't look like force. It didn't arrive with urgency. It didn't break the surface. It simplified it. The street didn't change. People still walked. Cars still passed. Conversations still drifted in fragments between strangers. But something had been removed. Not visibly, not dramatically, structurally. Carter felt it before he could define it. A connection he hadn't realized he was tracking was gone, not broken. Gone. The man beside him noticed Carter's pause. "What is it?" Carter didn't answer immediately. "Because this was new." "They've started isolating nodes," he said. The man's expression tightened. "That fast?" Carter nodded slowly. "Yes." A pause. "They skipped containment." That was the 25th problem. Because containment preserves the system. Isolation rewrites it. And rewriting doesn't leave things the way they were. "Which node?" the man asked. Carter looked ahead, then slightly to the side, not at anything specific. At absence. "Brighton," he said. Silence, because that name had come up before. Escalated. Refusal. Now, gone. "Gone how?" the man asked. Carter exhaled. "Disconnected." A pause. No further signals. That didn't mean shutdown. It meant something worse. No visibility, no feedback, no trace. "They cut it out," the man said. Carter didn't correct him, because that was close enough. "They removed its position," Carter said. More precise, more dangerous, because position is what connects patterns. Remove the position, and the pattern fragments. "They're protecting themselves," the man said. Carter shook his head. "No." A pause. "They're protecting the structure." And that distinction mattered more than anything, because structures, don't care about individual points, only stability. They started walking again, slower now, because speed was no longer an advantage. Understanding was. "They'll do it again," the man said. Carter nodded. "Yes." Pause. "And faster each time. Because once a method works, systems repeat it, optimize it, scale it." "They'll try to isolate us next," the man added. Carter didn't respond immediately, because that assumption was logical, but not correct. "No," he said. A pause. "They won't isolate us." The man frowned slightly. "Why not?" Carter looked ahead again, then answered. "Because we're not a node." Silence. "Because that changed the framework. Nodes can be removed. Sequences can't." "They can interrupt it," the man said. Carter nodded. "Yes." A pause. "But they can't erase it. Because sequences, once started, continue. Even if the system tries to hide them. Even if it tries to fragment them. Even if it tries to rewrite them. They still exist, just harder to see." They reached another intersection, this one different. No traffic, no pedestrians, too clean. "They're clearing space again," the man said. Carter nodded. "Yes." But this time it felt different. Not for observation, not for testing, for action. And that changed everything. "Do we move through it?" the man asked. Carter didn't answer immediately. Because this moment was the pivot. Not of the case, not of the investigation, of the entire structure. He looked at the empty intersection, then back at the man beside him. "If we stop," Carter said, "they close the sequence." A pause. "If we move..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Because the outcome was already understood. The man nodded once. "Then we move." No hesitation, no debate. Because this was the point of no return. They stepped forward, into the intersection. No sound, no movement, just space. And then, halfway across, everything shifted. Not visually, structurally. A pressure, not physical, but present, like the system itself, was focusing, converging. "This is it," the man said quietly. Carter nodded. "Yes." Because this was the response. Not hidden, not indirect, direct, for the first time. And that meant they had reached the center, not geographically, structurally, the point where everything connected and everything could be changed or removed. They kept walking, step by step, no acceleration, no hesitation, because this moment required completion, not reaction. And as they reached the other side, Carter spoke. "They think this ends here." The man beside him glanced at him. "Does it?" Carter shook his head. "No." A pause. "This is where it becomes undeniable." Silence. Because that was the one thing the system couldn't allow. Undeniable truth. Visibility that couldn't be rewritten. A pattern that couldn't be fragmented. And somewhere, far above all of it, the final decision triggered. Not to isolate, not to test, not to observe, but to engage fully. And when that happens, systems don't hold back. They don't adjust. They don't negotiate. They act. And whatever came next would not stay hidden. Not anymore. Full engagement didn't arrive like chaos. It arrived like alignment. Everything that had been subtle became precise. The air didn't thicken. The street didn't darken. No alarms, no sudden force. Instead, everything clicked into place. Carter felt it the moment his foot touched the sidewalk on the other side of the intersection. Not pressure, not resistance, synchronization. "They've locked the frame," he said quietly. The man beside him exhaled. "I feel it." Because now, nothing around them was random anymore. Movement had intent, spacing had purpose, timing had been calibrated, and that meant they were no longer moving through the system, they were inside its focus. That's not containment, the man said. Carter shook his head. No. A pause. It's convergence. That was the 26th problem, because convergence doesn't stop things. It brings them together, all variables, all paths, all outcomes, into one point, and they had just stepped into it. Across the street, the same black vehicle from earlier appeared again, not driving fast, not drawing attention, just present, as if it had always been part of the scene. The man noticed it this time. They're not hiding anymore, Carter nodded. They don't need to. Because now, visibility wasn't a weakness. It was control. A second vehicle turned the corner behind them, then a third. None of them marked, none of them aggressive, just positioned, like pieces on a board. They're closing options, the man said. Carter didn't respond, because options were never the real concern. Sequence was, and the sequence was still moving. A figure stepped out from the first vehicle, different from before, younger, sharp, focused, but carrying the same presence, the same structure, the same authority that didn't need to be explained. You've reached the final boundary, he said. His voice was calm, but unlike the others, there was no curiosity in it, only execution. Carter stopped, not because he was forced to, because this was the point. The man beside him stayed still, watching, measuring, waiting, because this was the moment everything had been building toward. There is no boundary, Carter said. The younger man tilted his head slightly. There is now. That line landed differently. Because it wasn't descriptive, it was declarative, meaning it had just been created. For them, here, now. The vehicles idled quietly, no doors opened, no one rushed out. Because force wasn't necessary. Everything was already in position. This is where the sequence ends, the man said. Carter shook his head slowly. No. A pause. This is where it connects. Silence. Because that was the one outcome they were trying to prevent. Connection. Between levels, between systems, between visibility and structure. You're not seeing the full system, the man said. Carter met his gaze. I am now. And that was the 27th problem. Because awareness at that level couldn't be contained. The man took a step forward. Then you understand why this can't continue. Carter nodded. Yes, a pause. But it already has. That answer didn't challenge the statement. It bypassed it. Because continuation was no longer a choice. It was already happening. The man's posture tightened slightly. Final opportunity, he said. Step out of the sequence. The words were clear, not aggressive, but absolute. The man beside Carter shifted slightly, not in fear, in calculation, because stepping out meant something. But Carter didn't hesitate. I can't, he said. A pause. Neither can you. That line landed deeper than anything else, because it turned the frame. The system wasn't outside the sequence. It was inside it. Now! For the first time. The younger man didn't respond immediately, because that implication wasn't part of the design. And yet, it was now unavoidable. You forced exposure, he said finally. Carter shook his head. No. A pause. You've reached it. Silence. Because that removed blame, removed control, removed choice. It simply was. And that was the most dangerous position of all. The vehicles remained still. The street remained quiet. The world remained unaware. But inside that space, everything had shifted. Completely. Because now, the system wasn't acting on them. It was reacting to itself. And systems, when forced to face themselves, don't behave predictably. The man stepped back, just slightly. then spoke into something unseen. Confirm escalation. A pause. Then, full exposure risk. That phrase moved through the space like a current, not loud, but final. Because that meant the system had reached its highest threshold, and once that threshold was crossed, there was no reverting, only outcome. Carter stood still, calm, unmoved, because this exact moment was what everything had been leading toward. Not the courtroom, not the judge, not the investigation. This, the point where the system had to choose between remaining hidden or becoming visible. And somewhere, far above all of it, that choice was being made. Choice at that level didn't take time. It took alignment, not debate, not discussion. Just a silent convergence of priorities that had already been decided long before this moment ever arrived. And when it happened, no signal announced it, no command echoed, no visible shift confirmed it. But Carter felt it immediately. The system didn't tighten, it didn't push, it didn't escalate in any way that could be measured from the outside. It stilled. And that was the 28th problem. Because stillness meant resolution, not hesitation, not uncertainty, decision. They chose, Carter said quietly. The man beside him didn't ask who. He didn't need to. What did they choose? He asked instead. Carter's eyes moved slightly. Not toward the vehicles, not toward the man in front of them, but beyond. They chose visibility, he said. Silence. Because that option was the one the system had been built to avoid at all costs. The younger man in front of them received something, not through a device, not through an earpiece, through presence, a shift. And for the first time, his posture changed, not defensive, not aggressive, acknowledging. He stepped back, not retreating, clearing the space. The vehicles behind him didn't move. The street didn't change. But something invisible had just opened. Proceed, the man said. 2 words, directed at Carter, not a command, a release. The man beside Carter frowned slightly. That's it? Carter didn't move yet, because this was the final test, not of action, of understanding. They're not stopping it, the man said quietly. Carter shook his head. No, a pause. They're stepping into it. That was the 29th problem. Because once a system chooses visibility, it doesn't collapse. It transforms, and transformation changes everything. Carter stepped forward, past the line, past the boundary that had just been declared, and nothing stopped him. No resistance, no interference. Because now, there was nothing left to block. The system had made its decision, and that decision included them. The man beside him followed, still cautious, still aware, but now understanding. They're integrating, he said. Carter nodded. Yes. Because isolation had failed, containment had failed, fragmentation had failed. There was only one option left. Incorporation. Make the sequence part of the system itself, so it couldn't exist outside it, so it couldn't expose it, so it couldn't break it. That changes the outcome, the man said. Carter didn't respond immediately, because outcome was still forming. No, he said finally. It changes the path. And that distinction was everything, because now the sequence wasn't ending. It was evolving. The younger man watched them pass. No interference, no words, just observation. But different now, not from above, from within. And that meant something fundamental had shifted. The system was no longer separate. It was connected. The vehicles pulled away slowly, not in retreat, in completion. Their role finished, for now. The street returned to normal. People moved again. Sound returned, space filled, as if nothing had happened. as if it had all been imagined. But Carter knew better. Because once something becomes visible, even for a moment, it can't go back. It can only change form. They walked another block, then another. No one followed, no one watched. At least, not in any way they could see. "Where does it go from here?" the man asked. Carter looked ahead, then slightly upward again. Because now, the next phase wasn't here. It wasn't in the streets, it wasn't in the courtrooms. It was higher. "It goes where it always does," Carter said. A pause. Up. Silence, because that was the final layer. Not regional, not structural, foundational. And whatever sat there, whatever had just chosen visibility, was now part of the sequence, whether it intended to be or not. They reached the end of the block. A car waited at the curb, plain, unmarked, but expected. Carter stopped, then opened the door. Before getting in, he said one last thing, not to the man beside him, not to anyone visible, but to the system itself. "You don't get to hide anymore." Then he stepped inside. The door closed. The car pulled away. And just like that, the visible part of the sequence ended. But the system had already begun its next move. And this time, it wouldn't happen in the open. It would happen where it mattered most. At the top, where decisions don't get recorded and consequences don't stay contained.